Locusta the Roman poisoner. In 54 CE, inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Claudius of Rome collapsed shortly after a private banquet. No blade had pierced his body. No assassin had been seen fleeing the scene. Witnesses described sudden convulsions, labored breathing, and a rapid decline that left the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth dead within hours. Official statements attributed the death to natural causes. Yet whispers began circulating immediately. The meal had included mushrooms, and somewhere in Rome, a woman named Locusta was known for crafting poisons so precise they could mimic illness down to the final tremor. Locusta was not a random herbalist or street alchemist. Contemporary accounts describe her as a specialist trained in toxicology long before the science had a name. She reportedly worked with compounds derived from hemlock, belladonna, arsenic mixtures, and extracts from rare Mediterranean plants. These were not crude substances. According to Roman writers, her concoctions could be calibrated to act within minutes or linger over several days. Doses were tested, refined, and in some cases demonstrated on condemned prisoners. Symptoms range from paralysis of the diaphragm to progressive organ failure that resembled fever or digestive collapse. In a society without forensic pathology, a well-designed poison left no visible wound and no clear accusation. What made Locusta extraordinary was not only her skill, but her protection. Under Emperor Nero, she was allegedly granted immunity and property in exchange for services rendered. Nero's ascension to power followed Claudius's sudden death, and ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius later hinted that Locusta had supplied the fatal compound. They described a first dose that acted too slowly, followed by a stronger preparation administered through a feather inserted into the emperor's throat under the guise of inducing vomiting. Whether embellished or accurate, the narrative established a pattern: poison as a political instrument, engineered with surgical intent. Physical descriptions of Locusta's laboratory are sparse, yet reports mention sealed containers, measured quantities of dried botanicals, and liquid extracts stored in small glass vessels. Rome was a nexus of trade routes spanning thousands of miles, from North Africa to Asia Minor. Ingredients could be sourced across continents. The precision attributed to her suggests systematic experimentation. Poisons had to be stable, transportable, and indistinguishable in taste when mixed with wine or food. This required method, patience, and repetition. Then something unusual happened. Instead of execution, which was common for convicted poisoners, Locusta was allegedly retained, even honored. She was later said to have assisted in the elimination of Britannicus, Nero's rival, during a banquet where the victim's wine triggered sudden collapse. Again, no sword, no battlefield, just a cup raised to the lips. After Nero's fall in 68 CE, references to Locusta grow fragmented. Some accounts claim she was executed under Galba. Others imply her records and formulas vanished. There are no surviving manuals, no physical remnants of her compounds, only hostile narratives written by male senators long after the events. The Roman elite had every incentive to frame imperial succession as scandal rather than strategy. If Locusta truly designed poisons capable of altering the fate of emperors, then Rome's history was not shaped solely by legions and laws, but by invisible chemistry administered in silence. And if the only surviving accounts come from political adversaries, the question remains unresolved. Was Locusta a calculating architect of death who weaponized biology centuries ahead of her time? Or was she transformed into a symbol of corruption to explain power shifts too complex for public admission? The Roman Empire was built on spectacle and force, yet in its most critical transitions, the decisive weapon may have been neither sword nor decree, but a measured drop in a silver cup. Empress Wu Zetian. In 655 CE, inside the imperial palace of Chang'an, a newborn princess died under circumstances so sudden that the entire Tang court was thrown into suspicion. The infant had been healthy hours earlier. By dawn, she was gone. Within days, the child's mother, consort Wu, accused Empress Wang of murder. The accusation triggered a chain reaction of investigations, demotions, and forced confessions. By the end of the year, Empress Wang had been deposed, imprisoned, and later executed. Consort Wu rose in rank. History would remember her as Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. The death of the infant remains one of the most debated episodes in Chinese imperial records. Some later historians allege that Wu herself had killed her daughter to frame the empress and eliminate a rival. Others suggest the charge was fabricated by Confucian scholars writing decades later, deeply uncomfortable with a woman occupying the dragon throne. What is certain is the pattern that followed. Over the next 3 decades, numerous officials who opposed Wu's consolidation of power were dismissed, exiled, or executed. The mechanisms of removal were bureaucratic, precise, and often legally justified. Arrest warrants cited treason, corruption, or conspiracy. Confessions were extracted, records were archived. Wu Zetian did not wield a sword on a battlefield. She wielded dossiers. Imperial archives from the late Tang period describe a network of informants operating within the capital. Reports flowed upward through coded memoranda. Officials who spoke critically of her policies were summoned for questioning. Some never returned. Others reappeared publicly disgraced, their families stripped of rank and property. The punishments followed codified law, yet the frequency of convictions among her critics was statistically striking. It suggested not chaos, but coordination. Administrative reforms under Wu strengthened centralized authority. She expanded the civil service examination system, allowing individuals outside the hereditary aristocracy to enter government. On the surface, this broadened opportunity. In practice, it also diluted the power base of elite families that opposed her. Political rivals were not only removed physically, they were structurally replaced. Descriptions of torture and brutality attributed to Wu's secret police appear in later chronicles. Some accounts detail instruments designed to force rapid confession. Others describe staged investigations that culminated in execution by strangulation or beheading. Yet the physical evidence for these specific methods is absent. The primary sources were compiled under subsequent dynasties that had incentive to portray her reign as a deviation from moral order. By 690 CE, Wu Zetian declared the Zhou dynasty, interrupting the Tang line and assuming the title of emperor. Official edicts were issued in her name. State rituals were reconfigured. The celestial mandate, traditionally reserved for men, was reinterpreted to justify her authority. Opposition did not disappear, but it grew quieter. After her death in 705 CE, the Tang dynasty was restored. Historians immediately began framing her era as one of manipulation and cruelty. Allegations multiplied: infanticide, mass purges, unrestrained ambition. Yet the empire under her rule remained territorially stable and economically functional. Infrastructure projects continued. Agricultural output did not collapse. Rebellions were contained. If Wu Zetian orchestrated the removal of rivals through calculated legal warfare, then she mastered the most sophisticated form of political elimination available in her era. If she did not, then the narrative of calculated brutality may have been constructed to caution future generations against female sovereignty. Her legacy rests on documents written by those who survived her reign or benefited from its reversal. The pattern of disappearances, trials, and executions is recorded. The intent behind them remains interpretive. Was Wu Zetian a silent strategist who converted the imperial bureaucracy into an instrument of lethal precision? Or did history require her to become ruthless in order to justify reclaiming the throne from her memory? Cleopatra of Egypt. In 30 BCE, inside a sealed chamber in Alexandria, Egypt's last ruling pharaoh awaited the arrival of Roman forces. Within days, Cleopatra VII would be dead. Ancient writers described a cobra concealed in a basket of figs. Others claimed a toxic ointment applied to her skin. Some insisted a hollow hairpin carried the fatal dose. The uncertainty surrounding her final moments has overshadowed a darker allegation that surfaced long before her suicide. According to several Roman accounts, Cleopatra had conducted controlled poison trials on prisoners to determine which toxin delivered the most painless death. These reports appear primarily in the writings of Plutarch and later Roman historians. Composed decades after Egypt fell under Roman rule, they describe a series of experiments in which condemned men were exposed to different venoms while physicians observed the effects. The substances allegedly included extracts from hemlock, opium derivatives, and the venom of Egyptian asps. observers reportedly noted the speed of paralysis, the presence or absence of convulsions, and the clarity of consciousness before death. The objective, according to these narratives, was not spectacle, but optimization. Egypt in the 1st century, BCE, was a crossroads of Mediterranean pharmacology. Trade routes extended from North Africa through the Levant and into Asia Minor. Alexandria housed one of the most advanced libraries and research centers of the ancient world. Knowledge of plant alkaloids, mineral toxins, and animal venoms was not mythical, it was catalogued. Greek physicians such as Dioscorides later documented dozens of toxic substances with detailed symptom profiles. Cleopatra's court would have had access to similar knowledge, especially given her education and fluency in multiple languages. Descriptions of venom behavior from the period indicate a surprisingly empirical understanding. Snake venom, when introduced into the bloodstream, produces progressive respiratory failure. Hemlock interferes with neuromuscular transmission, leading to ascending paralysis while leaving cognitive awareness intact. Opium in concentrated form depresses respiration and induces sedation. If experiments occurred, they may have been structured to compare onset time measured in minutes, muscular response, pupil dilation, and the presence of distress. Such observations would have required close physical proximity and clinical detachment. The political context intensifies the ambiguity. Cleopatra was locked in a high-stakes power struggle with Rome. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony placed her in direct opposition to Octavian. Roman propaganda portrayed her as decadent, manipulative, and dangerous. Depicting her as a woman calmly testing lethal compounds on prisoners served to reinforce that image. It transformed a sovereign strategist into a figure of cold experimentation. When Alexandria fell and Cleopatra died, Roman authorities seized state archives. Records that might have clarified these allegations were either destroyed or absorbed into imperial custody. No Egyptian medical scroll explicitly describes poison trials ordered by her. The surviving narrative belongs almost entirely to Roman victors. Yet the technical feasibility remains undeniable. The tools, substances, and intellectual environment required for systematic toxic observation existed. A ruler anticipating capture by a rival known for parading defeated enemies through Rome might plausibly seek control over the manner of death. Selecting a toxin that minimized visible suffering would have been a strategic calculation, not merely a dramatic gesture. If Cleopatra conducted venom trials, then she approached mortality as a problem to be engineered, not endured. If she did not, then the story functioned as a psychological weapon, crafted to erode sympathy for a foreign queen who defied Rome. The chamber in which she died contained no laboratory instruments, no preserved samples, no documented protocols, only a body and conflicting testimonies. Was Cleopatra a ruler who studied poison to command her own fate with precision? Or did Rome require her to be ruthless in order to justify conquering her kingdom? Olympias of Macedon. In 323 BCE, news spread across the Macedonian Empire that Alexander the Great was dead in Babylon. He was 32 years old. No clear successor stood ready. Within months, the most powerful empire on earth fractured into suspicion, rival claims, and quiet executions. At the center of the unfolding crisis stood Olympias, Alexander's mother. Ancient sources would later accuse her of orchestrating a series of calculated killings to secure her grandson's claim to the throne. The battlefield had shifted from distant territories to palace corridors. Olympias was not a passive royal widow. She was a Molossian princess from Epirus, raised in a court that blended political strategy with intense religious ritual. Accounts describe her participation in Dionysian ceremonies involving live snakes coiled around her arms. Later, historians use these details to frame her as mystical, unstable, and dangerous. Yet beneath the imagery lies a more concrete pattern. Following Alexander's death, his half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, was declared king, alongside the unborn child of Alexander's wife Roxana. Real power, however, rested with regents and generals. When Olympias returned to Macedonia in 317 BCE, she entered a civil war environment. Within months, Philip III and his wife Eurydice were captured. Both were executed. Sources claim Olympias ordered their deaths after forcing Eurydice to choose between suicide or execution. Several supporters of rival factions were allegedly put to death in rapid succession. Estates were confiscated. Political alliances dissolved overnight. Descriptions of these events appear primarily in the writings of Diodorus Siculus and later Roman historians who relied on earlier, now lost accounts. They emphasize brutality. They speak of vengeance. They suggest that Olympias targeted not only direct rivals, but extended family members linked to opposing generals. Yet the mechanics of these eliminations were political. Arrests were justified under claims of treason. Trials, if conducted, were swift. The executions followed established practices of the era, typically by sword or strangulation. There are no records of exotic torture devices or theatrical punishments. The narrative of savagery may have been amplified by those who later inherited power. What is clear is that Olympias operated in a system where succession disputes routinely ended in bloodshed. Macedonian royal politics had long involved assassination and forced suicide. Male rulers eliminated brothers, cousins, and generals when loyalty faltered. Olympias entered this arena at a moment of maximum instability. Her actions, whether defensive or aggressive, unfolded within weeks, not years. It was a campaign of consolidation under extreme pressure. After a brief resurgence of influence, Olympias herself was besieged by forces loyal to Cassander. When her city fell in 316 BCE, she was executed. Ancient accounts state that soldiers refused to kill her out of respect for her status, forcing Cassander to rely on relatives of her victims to carry out the sentence. The symbolism was deliberate. The narrative was sealed. Cassander later married into the royal line and assumed control. Historians writing under regimes that benefited from Olympias's removal had little incentive to portray her as pragmatic. Instead, she became the Serpent Queen, a woman whose maternal ambitions supposedly drowned Macedonia in blood. If Olympias engineered the deaths of Philip III and others, she did so in an environment where hesitation meant extinction. If she did not initiate the violence, then her role may have been exaggerated to simplify a chaotic power struggle into a tale of one dangerous woman. Alexander conquered continents through open warfare. His empire nearly collapsed through closed doors. Was Olympias a ruthless architect of royal elimination, or a participant in a system that demanded lethal decisiveness from anyone who wished to survive? Agrippina the Roman regent. In 54 CE, on a humid evening inside the imperial residence near Rome, Emperor Claudius dined on a dish of mushrooms considered a delicacy among the elite. Within hours, he was struggling to breathe. Witnesses reported vomiting, confusion, and a sudden collapse. Physicians were summoned. By dawn, the emperor was dead. The official announcement described natural causes. Yet, behind the marble walls of the palace, suspicion settled on one figure with the most to gain from his disappearance: Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's wife and the mother of Nero. Agrippina was born into the highest ranks of Roman nobility. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula and the niece of Claudius before becoming his wife. Her political positioning was not accidental. Marrying Claudius secured proximity to the throne. Securing her son's succession required more than proximity. It required timing. Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio later alleged that Agrippina collaborated with the poisoner Locusta to eliminate Claudius. They described a carefully measured toxin mixed into food, followed by a second administration delivered by a physician under the pretense of inducing vomiting when the first dose did not act quickly enough. The physical symptoms attributed to Claudius align with known toxic compounds available in Rome at the time. Certain plant-based alkaloids could induce severe gastrointestinal distress followed by respiratory failure. If administered in controlled quantity, they might mimic sudden illness. Yet no autopsy was conducted. There was no forensic analysis. The body was cremated swiftly, in accordance with imperial custom. What remains are narratives shaped by political hindsight. Agrippina's behavior following Claudius's death intensified suspicion. She allegedly delayed public announcement of the emperor's passing until Nero's position was secured by the Praetorian Guard. Palace gates were sealed. Communication was restricted. Senators were informed only after military loyalty was confirmed. This sequence suggests coordination, though coordination in Roman succession crises was not unusual. any transition required control of armed forces and public messaging. Once Nero was declared emperor at age 16, Agrippina appeared on coins alongside him, an unprecedented display of maternal authority. Official documents were said to pass through her hands. Foreign envoys reportedly negotiated in her presence. Such visibility may have alarmed male elites accustomed to indirect female influence. Within a few years, tensions between mother and son escalated. Nero gradually distanced himself. Agrippina's allies were removed from key positions. Ultimately, Nero ordered her assassination in 59 CE, staging a shipwreck that failed before sending soldiers to complete the task. The irony of her death reinforces the narrative constructed about her. A woman accused of poisoning her husband was later killed by her own son through elaborate planning. Roman writers portrayed this as poetic justice, yet their accounts were composed under emperors who had every reason to vilify Nero's lineage. Casting Agrippina as manipulative and murderous simplified the chaos of imperial politics into a moral fable. There are no surviving documents written by Agrippina herself explaining her intentions. No private correspondence detailing a conspiracy. Only male-authored histories describing ambition as pathology. Roman imperial politics was saturated with assassination, forced suicide, and strategic elimination. Emperors eliminated rivals routinely, yet Agrippina's alleged involvement remains one of the most sensationalized. If she orchestrated Claudius's death, she demonstrated strategic foresight in a system where hesitation meant annihilation. If she did not, then her image as a calculating poisoner may reflect Rome's discomfort with a woman who operated openly within structures of power. Claudius's body turned to ash. The evidence vanished with the smoke. Was Agrippina the architect of an emperor's death, or the most convenient explanation for a succession engineered by forces far larger than one woman? Boudica of Britannia. In 60 CE, in the Roman province of Britannia, 3 cities burned in rapid succession. Camulodunum fell first, then Londinium, then Verulamium. Roman accounts describe streets choked with smoke, temples collapsing in fire, and thousands of civilians killed within days. At the center of the uprising stood a woman the Romans called Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. To Rome, she became a symbol of savage retaliation. To her people, she may have been something else entirely. The revolt began after the death of her husband, King Prasutagus, who had attempted to secure peace by naming both his daughters and the Roman emperor as joint heirs to his kingdom. Rome ignored the arrangement. According to Tacitus, Roman officials annexed the territory, flogged Boudica publicly, and assaulted her daughters. The humiliation was deliberate and strategic. Within months, tribal alliances formed across eastern Britain. What followed was not a random riot, but a coordinated insurrection. Roman historians report that Boudica commanded tens of thousands of warriors. Exact numbers vary, often inflated for dramatic effect, but archaeological layers of ash confirm widespread destruction. Camulodunum, a Roman colony housing retired soldiers, was overrun. Temples were desecrated, administrative centers were destroyed, survivors fled. Londinium, a growing commercial hub, was abandoned by Roman authorities before being set ablaze. Excavations in modern London reveal a distinct Boudican destruction layer, roughly 2 to 3 feet thick, containing charred beams and melted debris. Tacitus claims that approximately 70,000 Roman citizens and allies were killed during the uprising. Cassius Dio offers similar figures. These numbers remain debated by modern scholars, yet even conservative estimates acknowledge mass casualties. The descriptions emphasize brutality, executions, ritual killings, and public humiliation of captives. However, the accounts come exclusively from Roman writers documenting an enemy rebellion. There are no surviving Iceni records detailing tactics or intent. Boudica herself is depicted as tall, fierce, with long red hair and a commanding voice. She reportedly addressed her troops from a chariot, invoking divine vengeance and tribal sovereignty. Yet beyond the speeches attributed to her by Roman authors, there is limited direct evidence of her personal role in specific acts of violence. As with many revolts, rage once unleashed may not have followed controlled lines. The Roman response was swift and calculated. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus regrouped a disciplined force of roughly 10,000 legionaries and auxiliary troops. In a decisive battle at an unknown location, Roman infantry formations absorbed the tribal assault and counterattacked. Tacitus describes a massacre of Britons, including non-combatants trapped behind wagons. Casualty estimates claim 80,000 Britons killed. Again, numbers likely served narrative purposes, emphasizing Roman superiority and the futility of resistance. After the defeat, Boudica disappears from the record. Some sources claim she took poison to avoid capture. Others suggest illness. There is no confirmed burial site, no physical remains. Only the Roman narrative survives. If Boudica directed systematic slaughter of Roman civilians, she demonstrated the same ruthless calculus often attributed to male conquerors. If Roman accounts exaggerated her actions to justify retribution and imperial dominance, then her image as a bloodthirsty queen may reflect propaganda designed to delegitimize rebellion. The destruction layers in British soil are tangible. The motives remain interpretive. Was Boudica a commander who unleashed calculated vengeance against an occupying power? Or did Rome amplify the violence of her revolt to reinforce a lesson about the cost of defiance? Empress Lu Zhi. In 195 BCE, the founder of the Han dynasty, Emperor Gaozu, died after consolidating one of the most powerful empires in East Asia. His passing did not trigger immediate collapse. Instead, authority shifted quietly into the hands of his widow, Lu Zhi. Officially, her young son became emperor. In practice, the court began to orbit around the Empress Dowager. Within a few years, rival consorts vanished, princes were demoted or executed, and key ministries were filled with members of the Lu clan. Ancient historians would later describe her reign with a single recurring theme: calculated elimination. The most infamous allegation concerns Lady Qi, a favored concubine of the late emperor, whose son was considered a potential threat to Lu Zhi's own child. According to the records of the Grand Historian, Lu Zhi ordered Lady Qi mutilated and confined, transforming her into what the text chillingly calls a human swine. The description is graphic, intended to shock, yet it appears in chronicles compiled under subsequent dynasties that had political reasons to discredit the Lu family's brief dominance. No physical evidence survives. The episode exists solely within narrative tradition. What is more concrete is the pattern of political restructuring that followed Gaozu's death. Princes from collateral branches of the imperial family were reassigned to distant territories. Some were accused of plotting rebellion and executed under formal charges. Administrative posts increasingly went to relatives loyal to Lu Zhi. The central bureaucracy remained functional. Taxation continued. Military garrisons were maintained. From a structural perspective, the empire did not descend into chaos. It tightened. Lu Zhi's methods appear less theatrical and more procedural than later legends suggest. Arrests were carried out under codified law. Decrees cited treason or misconduct. Executions, when ordered, followed established legal frameworks of the Han court. The scale of elimination, however, was significant enough to alarm contemporaries. After her death in 180 BCE, a swift coup removed members of the Lu clan from power. Many were executed in coordinated purges, erasing their influence almost overnight. The speed of this reversal shaped the historical record. Victors wrote the chronicles. Casting Lu Zhi as excessively cruel justified the eradication of her lineage. Confucian ideology, which emphasized hierarchical harmony and male authority, framed her dominance as unnatural disruption. Descriptions of sadism may have functioned as moral reinforcement. Yet beneath the rhetoric lies a strategic reality. Succession in early imperial China was rarely secure. Empresses who failed to protect their sons risked exile or death. Court factions competed for proximity to the throne. In this environment, hesitation could dismantle a dynasty within months. Lu Zhi operated in a system where removal of rivals was not an anomaly, but an expectation. Archaeological findings from early Han tombs confirm continued state stability during her regency. Agricultural reforms remained in place. Border defenses were intact. There is no material evidence of widespread internal collapse. The violence, if accurately described, was concentrated within elite circles. If Lu Zhi orchestrated targeted eliminations to secure her son's reign, she applied the same ruthless calculus used by male founders before her. If later, historians amplified her cruelty to serve ideological narratives, then the image of the Iron Empress reflects fear more than fact. The Han dynasty endured for centuries after her regency. Her name endured as warning. Was Lu Zhi an architect of disciplined political survival, or did the machinery of history require her to embody cruelty to restore patriarchal order? Pharaoh Neferusobek. In 1806 BCE, at the close of Egypt's 12th dynasty, the royal line faltered. A series of short reigns destabilized succession. Then, for the first time in nearly 2 millennia of pharaonic rule, a woman assumed full titulary authority as king. Neferusobek adopted the 5 royal names traditionally reserved for male pharaohs. Reliefs depict her wearing the Nemes headdress and even elements of the false beard. Within 4 years, her reign ended abruptly, the records thin, and then silence. Unlike queens who ruled as regents for sons, Neferusobek ruled in her own right. Her inscriptions appear at sites such as Hawara and the Fayum region, where she completed construction projects begun under Amenemhat III. Stone blocks bearing her cartouche confirm administrative continuity. Yet after her death around 1802 BCE, the dynasty collapsed into the Second Intermediate Period. Later, king lists omit her entirely. Some scribes left blank spaces where her name should have appeared. The omission is deliberate. Ancient Egyptian succession was rarely peaceful. Rival claimants, priestly factions, and regional governors competed for legitimacy. If Neferusobek secured the throne amid contested inheritance, she would have confronted opposition from male elites unwilling to accept a female sovereign. There are no surviving documents describing executions ordered by her hand. However, abrupt disappearances of potential heirs during this transitional period have led some scholars to speculate that rival claimants were neutralized before she consolidated authority. Archaeological layers from the late 12th dynasty show administrative disruption, but not immediate collapse. Grain storage records indicate continuity. Temple offerings continued, yet inscriptions bearing the names of certain princes cease suddenly. Whether these gaps represent natural death, erasure, or political removal remains uncertain. Egypt's practice of damnatio memoriae, deliberate erasure of a ruler's name from monuments, complicates reconstruction. If Neferusobek faced resistance, any actions taken to eliminate challengers may have been obscured by subsequent regimes. The material culture associated with her reign reflects calculated adaptation. Statues depict her with both feminine dress and masculine regalia, blending identity to reinforce authority. This was not symbolic decoration. It was political messaging carved in stone. The decision to present herself as king rather than queen suggests acute awareness of the fragility of her position. After her death, the throne passed to Sobekatep I, initiating a new dynasty. Later, scribes compiling the Turin king list either excluded her or recorded her briefly before moving on. Such marginalization shaped her legacy into near invisibility. Unlike Hatshepsut centuries later, Neferusobek left no grand mortuary temple proclaiming triumph. Her burial site remains debated, possibly at Mazguna, though no definitive identification exists. If Neferusobek removed rivals to secure her reign, the evidence has been buried beneath deliberate historical omission. If she did not, then the disappearance of her record reflects a broader discomfort with female kingship in a system anchored to male divine lineage. Egyptian history is inscribed in stone, yet even stone can be chiseled away. Was Neferusobek a quiet eliminator of dynastic threats whose actions were later erased, or did later scribes erase her memory precisely because she ruled without male mediation? Queen Brunhilda. In 575 CE, the Frankish kingdom fractured along bloodlines and ambition. King Sigebert I was assassinated, reportedly by agents loyal to his rival brother Chilperic I. At the center of the escalating feud stood Brunhilda, Sigebert's widow and queen of Austrasia. What began as dynastic rivalry evolved into decades of calculated retaliation, shifting alliances, and targeted eliminations. Medieval chroniclers would later depict Brunhilda as a mastermind behind a chain of assassinations that destabilized Merovingian Europe for nearly half a century. Brunhilda was not born into the Frankish court. She was a Visigothic princess from Iberia, married into a volatile royal network where loyalty rarely outlived opportunity. After Sigebert's death, she assumed regency for her young son, Childebert II. Governance required navigating a landscape where mayors of the palace, bishops, and rival queens wielded competing authority. Surviving correspondence and chronicles indicate that Brunhilda actively appointed officials, negotiated alliances, and commissioned infrastructure projects, including fortifications and roads spanning dozens of miles. Her administrative competence is documented. So too are repeated claims that she orchestrated revenge. Gregory of Tours and later the Chronicle of Fredegar describe a pattern of retaliatory killings between Brunhilda and her rival, Queen Fredegund of Neustria. Assassins allegedly moved across territories under cover of diplomatic travel. Poisonings and ambushes are referenced, though details are sparse and often sensationalized. Several Merovingian princes died under ambiguous circumstances during these conflicts. Whether Brunhilda directly ordered their deaths or merely benefited from the shifting balance of power remains contested. The political context was inherently violent. Frankish succession custom-divided kingdoms among male heirs, virtually guaranteeing rivalry. Eliminating a nephew or cousin could consolidate territory overnight. Male rulers engaged in similar strategies without earning epithets of monstrosity. Brunhilda's alleged ruthlessness, however, is repeatedly emphasized in narrative sources. Her actions are described not as necessity, but as obsession. By the early 7th century, Brunhilda had outlived multiple kings and regents. She ruled on behalf of successive grandsons, maintaining influence across regions separated by hundreds of miles. Such longevity in a system built on male military dominance was extraordinary. It also generated enemies. In 613 CE, after losing the support of key nobles, she was captured by Clotaire II. The method of her execution was theatrical. Chroniclers claim she was tortured for 3 days and then tied to a wild horse, dragged to death before being dismembered. The spectacle ensured her memory would be inseparable from brutality. The reliability of these descriptions is uncertain. Medieval chroniclers often amplified violence to frame moral lessons. Brunhilda's defeat served as a narrative closure to decades of instability. Portraying her as a Black Widow justified her eradication and the consolidation of power under Clotaire II. Archaeological evidence from Austrasian territories during her regencies shows continued coin minting, church patronage, and administrative continuity. There is no material indication of societal collapse during her rule. The violence, as recorded, was concentrated within elite circles engaged in dynastic struggle. If Brunhilda commissioned assassinations to preserve her lineage's claim, she operated within established norms of Merovingian politics. If later writers exaggerated her agency to personify an era of chaos, then the image of the scheming widow reflects narrative convenience. Across nearly 50 years, kings rose and fell. Brunhilda remained. Was she the architect of a prolonged cycle of calculated elimination, or the most visible participant in a system that devoured its own heirs regardless of gender? Queen Ranavalona I. In 1828, on the island of Madagascar, Queen Ranavalona I seized the throne following the death of King Radama I. Within weeks, potential rivals were arrested. Some were executed, others vanished into prison compounds built inland, far from coastal trade routes. European missionaries stationed near the capital reported a sudden tightening of royal authority. Treaties were revoked, foreign advisors were expelled. What followed would later be described in Western accounts as one of the most brutal reigns of the 19th century. Although her rule technically extends into the early modern era, the political structure she inherited was rooted in traditional Merina monarchy. Succession was rarely uncontested. Noble factions maneuvered to place preferred candidates on the throne. Ranavalona's ascent appears to have involved strategic alliances with military commanders and court elites who favored isolationist policy. Once crowned, she initiated a purge of individuals suspected of supporting rival claims. Official edicts frame these actions as defense of sovereignty. One of the most controversial elements associated with her reign is the Tangina ordeal, a judicial practice involving ingestion of poison extracted from the Cerbera odolum tree. The accused consumed the substance alongside pieces of chicken skin. Survival after expelling the skin was interpreted as innocence. Failure was fatal. European observers documented high mortality rates, claiming tens of thousands perished annually. Modern historians debate these numbers, suggesting missionary accounts may have exaggerated figures to emphasize moral contrast between European Christianity and Malagasy tradition. Military campaigns during Ranavalona's reign targeted regions resisting central authority. Forced labor systems expanded to support infrastructure and defensive projects. Roads, palaces, and fortifications were constructed across mountainous terrain. Mortality among laborers was significant, though similar systems existed under previous rulers. The scale of enforcement intensified under her administration. Reports of execution methods range from firing squads to cliff-edge punishments. However, detailed descriptions appear primarily in foreign diaries and correspondence written by individuals expelled or marginalized by her policies. Malagasy oral traditions present a more complex portrait, emphasizing her determination to prevent foreign domination during a period when European colonial expansion accelerated across Africa. After her death in 1861, her successor reopened relations with Europe. Missionary publications from the following decades solidified her image as the Mad Queen, responsible for catastrophic population decline. Yet demographic data from the period remains incomplete. Archaeological surveys do not indicate widespread urban abandonment. Agricultural terraces continued functioning. Royal architecture from her era still stands in Antananarivo. If Ranavalona employed harsh judicial and military measures to consolidate power and resist external control, she did so within a geopolitical landscape increasingly hostile to independent kingdoms. If mortality figures were inflated to justify later intervention, then her legacy as an indiscriminate killer reflects colonial narrative framing. Her reign lasted 33 years. The kingdom was not annexed during her lifetime. Was Ranavalona the first a ruler who preserved sovereignty through uncompromising force, or did subsequent empires require her to embody cruelty to rationalize the reshaping of Madagascar? Conclusion: these women were not isolated anomalies scattered across distant centuries. Their stories reveal a recurring pattern that stretches from ancient Rome to imperial China, from Hellenistic courts to African highlands. In each case, power shifted. Rivals disappeared, authority consolidated, and soon after, narratives emerged describing cruelty, poison, manipulation, or blood. The pattern is not merely one of violence, it is one of memory. This is not to claim innocence, nor to declare guilt. Dynastic politics in every era was lethal. Emperors executed brothers, kings ordered assassinations, generals eliminated rivals without hesitation. Yet when women stood at the center of similar transitions, the language of history hardened. Poison became treachery. Consolidation became obsession. Political elimination became monstrous appetite. Across these cases, another pattern appears. The primary sources were written after the fact. Roman senators chronicled Agrippina and Locusta under new regimes. Confucian scholars documented Wu Zetian after her dynasty ended. Medieval clerics shaped Brunhilda's legacy in the courts of her enemies. Missionaries defined Ranavalona's rule from positions of cultural conflict. The mechanism repeats. A ruler falls, the victor's right, the narrative crystallizes. If even a fraction of the accusations are accurate, then these women mastered the same ruthless calculus that sustained empires for centuries. If the accounts were amplified, then history itself became a weapon, reshaping political survival into moral warning. The consequence reaches beyond biography. It challenges the assumption that power, when held by women in antiquity, was inherently unnatural. It raises the possibility that elimination, secrecy, and control were systemic tools, not gendered aberrations. And if records can be sculpted so precisely, how many other reputations were engineered to stabilize regimes after the fact? The question is not whether these rulers were capable of ruthlessness. Many rulers were. The deeper question is why their ruthlessness became legend while others became statecraft. Until historical memory is examined with the same scrutiny applied to ancient crimes, every archive remains a potential indictment written by the last survivor. And the most dangerous weapon in any empire may not have been poison, sword, or decree, but the version of events that endured.